Well, let's go ahead and get started with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for these women and men. Thank you for the joy it is to serve alongside people who are called by your name and who are passionate for you and your kingdom. We pray your blessing upon the Every Campus Coalition, Lord God, every single individual, the leadership role that they have in their organization, denomination, church network. We're so thankful, Lord God, and we continue to pray with great fervor for revival in our lives, in our organizations, on our college campuses. Lord, may you break through in a mighty way with a movement of your spirit like we've never seen in our time. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ed Stetzer here, who seemingly needs no introduction, but just for those of you who may have been living under a rock, Ed is I consider Ed to be one of the great conveners of our time, great kingdom builder, visionary, missiologist. There are lots and lots of things that we could say about Ed Stetzer. And I thought as we got together, what would be good to ask him would be the question of what is the role of campus ministry for the future of the church? And for many, many of us, myself included, we are in the line of work that we're in because we believe that, God loves all people. He wants the gospel to go to the ends of the earth. But there's something specifically unique and strategic about the university world. And we've all heard the line and probably used the line to raise money, that it's the most strategic mission field in the world, that tomorrow's CEOs are on our college campuses today. Doctors, lawyers, nurses, whatever it might be, the future leaders of America are studying right now. They're undergraduates, they're graduates, they're faculty, and we're committed to the university setting. And I think from where Dr. Ed Stetzer sits, he's in a unique position to be able to answer that question. What is the role? Why is the university strategic for the mission of the church? And so go ahead, Ed, and share your heart with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I just appreciate you actually doing half my talk in the few minutes of the introduction, why you think it's strategic. Now, of course, it's a bit like preaching to the choir, I guess, to share something with some of you. So I'm trying to talk about some things that maybe are a little different than what you've already learned or known, because I would say that I would want to listen to you about why the university is strategic. But I'm going to go through actually just a series of things that I want to point to why the ministry in college university settings is particularly strategic if we want to look for a missiological impact in culture. Why college university settings are particularly strategic if we want to look for a missiological impact in culture. And of course, let's start with history. We know that past awakenings, and we won't just talk about awakenings, but past awakenings have consistently happened or broke out, to use a term that they actually would use in some of the awakenings, among first college students. And we actually, because we don't have like 2,000 years of college ministry, that's not a thing. 1,000 years ago, but very, very limited 1,000 years ago. Now much more normative. But in the times that we do have, where we have a robust college and university culture, you actually do find that it's actually young adults who themselves sort of step out and step into what God is doing, and it leads to an impact in the broader culture. And we can use all kinds of examples of that. I won't rehearse what I'm guessing you already know about the student volunteer movement. I'm guessing you already know lots of things that come from that. But it's interesting too. Even the examples we could use here. I'm at Wheaton College, and just 60 feet from me is a journal by Jim Elliot. The actual journal would say he is no fool. And in there we find out, we all like, when I say Jim Elliot's name, you probably have a mental picture, and he looks like a 38-year-old because of movies and things that came later on. But Jim Elliot was a college kid. He was just a young kid. And there's a clear pattern that historically, last 200 to 300 years, we see among young adults these kinds of spiritual outbreaks. And if we look back before that, and we can actually find, we have to remember that the idea of a longevity of life is also somewhat of an invention of the modern age. So the disciples, probably quite young. We don't quite know. The whole idea even of Jesus dying when he's 33 is totally not found anywhere in scripture. So I was talking to Saddleback's doing a big thing on the 20th anniversary of the Great Commission on 2033, and all built around the idea that Jesus died or gave the Great Commission in 33, which of course nobody really believes, but it's still fun. It's a nice number. We can build on that. So I'm not mad at them for math. I'm just saying that that's bad math. But the idea here is that there's a consistency that young adults are in a time of formation that actually causes them to consider spiritual things that otherwise, once we begin to build the construct and the scaffolding becomes the building and the building is built on the building, by the time you get the fifth floor of building your life, your engagement of the spiritual is lessened. And so the opportunity here is obvious and substantial. Let me also mention too, that even when times when we don't think of like college universities, it's actually often college and universities, right? So you think about the Jesus People movement. We just came back from Biola University 3 weeks ago, and we did a kind of a 50th anniversary. It's not really the 50th anniversary, but again, math is hard. So we did a big anniversary thing at Biola University on the Jesus People movement, and all the stories that we tell. Well, the stories were about either college students or people who dropped out of college to pursue, the counterculture that was ultimately there. And today, depending on who you ask, 20 to 30 million people trace their spiritual heritage to the outbreak of the Holy Spirit of the Jesus People movement, including me. Later, generation later, but I can trace a line to it as well. So we start by just looking at history, right? We know that makes sense. Number two, I think we want to look to the college context is tumult. Tumult is a key word today. Tumult is a key word. We're living in a time of tumult, unlike anything we've seen probably since the 60s. I want to refer you to a book. It's going to be an article by David Brooks, and it'll help us to kind of think about this issue. I'm going to drop it in the chat so you can take a look at it. But one of the things that David Brooks talked about, David's a new follower of Jesus, and I had him in class recently. But the article that we talked about in class is actually here. I'm going to just see if I can share the screen if I have permission to do that. I do have permission to do that. So let me see. But you can take a look here. This is actually the article that I'm going to briefly mention to. America is having a moral convulsion. And, talks about, every 60 years, America seems to go through I kind of renamed it, and let me drop this in the chat for you. And I renamed it from a cultural convulsion to from a moral convulsion to a cultural convulsion. There's the David Brooks article. And so what seems to be happening is that we're going through this tumult, right? This unprecedented tumult that actually, for many of us, is not it's like nothing we've ever seen in our lifetime. So I actually, after talking to David Brooks, Josh Laxton here's on the call with me. He works with me, and we work together on this article that I just dropped in there. And I talked about 3 trends shaping the post-pandemic church, and citing David Brooks' article, I renamed it to a cultural convulsion. We're going through an every 60-year cultural convulsion. We saw one in the 60s. We saw one in the late 1800s, where basically what happens is, he says America, I'd say it's the West. The West just basically social trust collapses. We ultimately get to the place where we question the sources of authority and more, where we're debating about the very nature of what's true and what's not true. It's epistemological crisis and more. And so what's happening right now is there's a tumult, and tumult is always found disproportionately present. Let me say it again. Tumult is always found disproportionately present in college and university. So if the culture's fraying apart, the college and university has frayed. In other words, it's you typically years ahead of that cultural context. And so we feel that tumult and remarkable pace of turbulence on the campus context, right? So that tumult is all around us. That's not the only part of the story as well. What happens is cultural change is accelerated in times of tumult. There's a really helpful article I'm also going to drop in the chat. Let me just show it to you first. And this article was by Ross Douthat, Red Douthat. He's former evangelical, now devout Roman Catholic, New York Times columnist as well. He's called "Waking Up in 2030." The date of this is worth noting. It's last year, but the suspended time of the pandemic has put history on fast forward. So his thesis, which I think is correct, is that things we would have been talking about for 10 years, it was 2020, we wrote this, 2030, by the time we talk about this, are suddenly right before us. So think about same-sex marriage, the America changing its mind on sexuality. That took from Stonewall. It's just a historic event when the civil rights, when the LGBTQ plus community would say the civil rights movement for that community began. From Stonewall to Obergefell is decades. Yet gender identity is years. And matter of fact, in 2020, 2021, it's months. So this rapid acceleration of cultural change is part of that tumult, right? So what we're dealing with on university campuses is really people having significant questions about who they are, their identity, where the world is going, why it ultimately matters. So just drop that in the chat for you as well. So that tumult is, well, I also believe an opportunity for the good news of the gospel to be spread. But boy, we certainly experience that on the college campus. Now again, I'm at a Christian college campus. Just so we're clear, those of you who don't know, I work at Wheaton College. I'm the dean of one of our schools here. I have two daughters in college and university. One at the University of Toronto doing her master's degree in music, and I will tell you that her conversation to me is fascinating, because again, where we wake up in 2030, this sudden acceleration is often going to be reflected on the college campus. So I'll give you an example. So I'm helping out Wycliffe College, which is part of the University of Toronto. Some of you are familiar with Wycliffe. And so this week I did their principal's dinner. They don't call it president. I did their principal's dinner. My wife's Canadian. My children are all dual citizens. So my daughter's attending there. And so we began with at the University of Toronto, Wycliffe College, which is an evangelical seminary in the Anglican tradition, with all that means. So all of you would find this a robust, theologically committed institution to evangelicalism broadly. In the Canadian context, I did tell them, don't think of evangelicalism as American evangelicalism, because I'm trying not to every day, but that's another story for another day. So we began with an acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples who had occupied the land. Now, that will get you on the front page of a blog here in the United States, because it's too woke to do that. But the reality is that this is a deeply committed 1877, deeply rooted theologically, that has acknowledged now that there have been historic injustices. And if you're following the Canadian context, indigenous schools and more, that this is an appropriate thing to do. It's not dissimilar to what we did when we were together at Urbana, where we acknowledged that as well. Now, that'll get you on a blog, which I can tell you I've been on plenty of blogs, so don't lose a lot of sleep about that. But that'll get you on a blog. But this is part of the shift in culture. People are asking, how do we right past wrongs? And a particularly engaged group in that conversation is university and college students. And what that appears to people who are, well, let's just use boomers as an example, because I'm not a boomer, so we can talk about them. Where boomers are often going to be like, well, what is this? Why would an evangelical Christian, in this case, Wycliffe College, acknowledge the ancestral ownership of the land from indigenous peoples? Well, because we're in the midst of a tumult, and one of the things, we're addressing issues that we haven't addressed in the past. So what seems very normal and natural to a college student, well, we shouldn't have campus buildings named after slaveholders or slave sellers, for that matter, and slave merchants, and yet is like, well, this just seems, in the culture, there's a cultural distance, but there's a desire to right wrongs in that young adult context. So we start history. We look at the opportunity that's great before us. We go to tumult. Let me go thirdly to missiology. And let's talk about that for just a few minutes. So why that? Because that's what I do. I'm a missiologist, so I'm gonna naturally kind of zero in on this. And there's literally, I shouldn't say thousands. I guess there could be a 1,000-year history in missiological writing, and before that, we would just call them different things. But when we think about the importance of mission engagement on university campuses, right? Yeah, sure, we could say that's the next generation, but in missiology, it's the current generation. right? It's the people who are already swimming in the cultural currents that are out there as well. As a Gen Xer, I got to learn the language of culture, whereas other people, this is just the language and the context in which they are from. And we also know, when we talk about international students, now, of course, that everything was upended in 2020. But when we kind of look at international students, we can actually see things like the percentage of international students here. What a missiological opportunity, right? The 372,000 in 2019 from China, 193 from India. What an opportunity for gospel impact there. The fourth largest is actually the Saudi kingdom, 30,000, 31,000 when you round up. So the opportunity is great. So obviously the nations are coming to university. So thankful for the work of many of you on this screen representing the advance of the gospel. The missiological opportunity is ethno-linguistic, right? Subpoint under missiology. Number 3, missiology. The missiological opportunity is ethno-linguistic. And we don't want to miss that. Second, the missiological opportunity is generational, right? This is the most likely place where a robust engagement in the next generation will take place is in a campus ministry setting. The most likely place outside of a local church setting. Because again, there's a bit of a cocooning effect that takes place when you're a teenager going to student ministry. But now, if you're at the University of Illinois or University of Toronto, where my daughter is, the opportunity, the place here is evident. And I would say also, too, this is where, if you care about global missions, I want you to miss this. If you care about global missions, you need to care about university missions. Say it again so you don't miss it. If you care about global missions, you need to care about university missions, because this is the time, what is most likely, will people will say yes. They'll put their yes on the table, let God put it on the map, and engage in that cross-cultural mission endeavor. So college isn't just a place to build a platform for a career. It could be the place of transformation with people who want to right wrongs, with people who care about injustice, with people who are at the stage in their life when they can make decisions that are harder for somebody with 3 kids starting it out in elementary school. And we can call them to those new missiological realities. So 3 big things I want to talk to you about: history, tumult, and missiology. I think point to that opportunity. My understanding is I'm supposed to go 15 minutes, and I'm about to be done with that. So I'll turn it back over to York and see what kind of questions or dialogue you might want to have.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you so much, Ed, and it's an honor to have been with you in this coalition from the beginning. So just appreciate you a lot. I think what we're going to do, I've written down some questions, and Chad's going to distribute those. We're going to push people into small groups, and then when we come back, we'll actually have a presentation from Springtide Research that will continue our conversation. So Ed, appreciate you a ton. Thanks for your insights. Now we're going to send people into small groups so they can talk amongst themselves.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Josh, anything else you'd like to say by way of introduction? And if not, go ahead right in. And after Josh's presentation, we'll jump back into discussion groups. We'll load that same document with a question or 2. So Josh, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, folks. I won't spend any time on my bio. If you're interested, you can figure that out from other places. If I say I was a professor of sociology for a while before coming over to start Springtide here in the last few years, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to get to bring some of the stuff that we understand inside of the academy out into the real world, where it probably is more well suited. I'm going to share my screen here and share with you some of what we've been learning at Springtide over the last couple of years. What we do here is, well, let me start with our mission statement, since we are so new. We believe no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. Everything we do is focused right there at 13 to 25. We're a research institute. We're sociological in nature. And so we do a whole lot of surveys, a whole lot of interviews, but it's not just the research that we do. We're trying to translate these things into action. And the research itself, from every step of the process, is informed by actual voices of young people. Internally, we have 2 mantras that guide what we do. We don't want to be a bunch of old people studying young people. And so we have a number of ways that young people engage with us on a systematic and structured way: an advisory board, interns, writing fellow, BIPOC research fellow, et cetera. But then the other mantra that we have is that we say all the time that we don't want to be interesting, we want to be useful, which is a strange place sometimes for a research institute to be. We want to, while retaining our objectivity and credibility, we very much have a stake in the game. We believe that young people are better off when their religious lives are well considered and well attended to. I apologize if you can hear. We're having some work done in the house. We'll see if it gets too loud. Hopefully not. And over the last couple of years, we've collected a lot of data. We've done nearly 250 qualitative interviews, collected over 22,000 nationally representative survey responses of 13 to 25-year-olds, not just 18 and up, going down to 13, and over 16 focus groups. A lot of people get carried away with the 22,000 survey responses, but if you've ever tried to talk to a young person on the actual telephone, you know it's the 230 interviews that are far and away more impressive than the 22,000 survey responses, because that means that our research team probably had to call, I don't know, 1,000 young people to get those 230 responses. The best way I know to sum all of this up and stick to the start on time and get out early mantra is to do this in sort of an unfolding sentence. And we'll start with this spot. What we've learned at Springtide is that we're not experiencing a crisis of belief yet. Largely, the story that we tell ourselves about young people is using these really old metrics and markers about affiliation and attendance. And when we pay attention to those markers, which we used for a long time just as proxies for what we really care about, which is belief, they were really good proxies, I think, for some long period of time, decades, most of the 20th century. But they're not anymore. And so we've gotten really, without that understanding, though, without understanding what's underneath those numbers and how that's shifted, we've gotten very concerned about trends like this. This is the rise of the nuns here from the General Social Survey. Of course, Gallup and Pew and others have documented this as well. When we look at it with our own data for 13 to 25-year-olds, it's about 40% claim no religious affiliation, meaning when you ask them to check the box, Christian, Protestant, Christian, Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, et cetera, and on, the last few boxes have atheist, agnostic, and none. And when we look at some combination of those, that's how we get that category. So increasingly, young people, like the rest of the population, are choosing to not affiliate with a particular religious tradition. But that doesn't mean that their beliefs have gone away. So we still find about 71% of young people who say they're religious, about 78% who say that they're spiritual. We unpack all of this in the State of Religion and Young People from 2020. So if you're really interested in digging behind these numbers, the State of Religion and Young People is an annual study that we do. And last year was our deep dive into the data was really looking underneath these numbers. And we find some very interesting things, like a high percentage of people with no affiliation still pray and attend worship. And over half of young people who say they are affiliated don't trust organized religion at all. So I think these are really bad markers that have been guiding a lot of our decision making for quite some time now. They're not inherently bad. Like I said, I think they were really good for a long time. They're just not useful anymore because largely the world has changed. And when the world has changed, it calls for us to look at new ways of measuring and understanding what's going on as proxies for people's belief. And when we ask young people directly, what we see is that they're interested, generally speaking, in the conversation about faith. There has not been this falling off the table of young people's desire to have conversations that are essentially religious conversations. What happens when I die? Is there a God? What should I do with my life? What's the moral system that I should be guided by, et cetera? They want to have those conversations. And they're looking to you, to adults when they can find them, to help guide those. They're just not always able to find them. And let's think about why for just a second. While we're not in a belief crisis, we are in the middle of a trust revolution. So when we look at trust and confidence in institutions from the 1970s to today, this is data from Gallup, we see quite an alarming trend. And if you can't figure out the trend, here's a cheat sheet to help you. Your eyes probably go directly to the bottom one, to organized religion. If organized religion were the only one that had experienced a drop, we'd be having a much different conversation. I would be telling you, or probably even I wouldn't be the one having this conversation as a sociologist. It would be somebody else more well-versed in your particular religious tradition telling you to clean up your own house, essentially. But that's not what's happened here. Young people haven't lost trust, and people in general haven't lost trust in religious institutions because religious people have done something wrong or bad. We as a society have lost trust in institutions generally. And not just in, this is with all adults, because this comes from Gallup, 18 and older. When we look at just young people, again, 13 to 25-year-olds with Springtide's own data, we see very, very similar story. This is a scale of 1 to 10. So even nonprofit organizations at the top are not doing particularly well, at just barely cracking the midway point. And you see organized religion there just under 5. The trust revolution then has this real implication in a couple of ways. It's led primarily to this belonging crisis that is incredibly counterintuitive when we think about Gen Z. So Gen Z is the loneliest generation. I don't just mean that they're the loneliest generation that we have right now. They're the loneliest generation that has ever been recorded using the standard UCLA Loneliness Index developed in the 1970s and administered hundreds of times over the last 40 years to different groups of people. It's always the oldest generation that is the loneliest, until Cigna did this massive study in 2015, 2016, and found that Gen Z, for the first time ever, the youngest cohort, was the most lonely, and that their loneliness scores were higher than had ever been recorded in the whole history of using this instrument. We found the same thing, again, extending down to 13 years old at Springtide. Now, this is counterintuitive because when we think about young people, we think about them on their devices and super connected on social media and to their friends all the time, and they are. But those connections aren't sufficient. While they are incredibly necessary, and adults who dismiss what happens online do so at their own peril, they lose respect and credibility among young people. There's a whole lot of in real life stuff that is being affected by this lack of institutional trust and the connections that used to come along with that institutional participation. Those connections are no longer intact. And so the isolation levels are off the charts. When we look specifically then at loneliness in Gen Z, we see some alarming numbers. In the top there, it's adults I have in my life I could turn to if I needed them. This is a check all that applies, so you could pick every single category. We see that only 8% of Gen Z feels like they could turn to a religious leader if they needed them. Only 8%. 27% of young people have one or fewer adults in their life that they could turn to if they needed to talk. And before you ask, this does include their parents. That number does include their parents. And 70% or so say that they have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a daily basis. This is a hidden epidemic of loneliness and isolation. It's very real and very present. And it probably gives, if you didn't understand it already, because you're just seeing it every day on your campuses, this probably helps to connect some dots for things that you are seeing. Usually when I present this to youth ministers and people who are working with boots on the ground, this is not an aha moment for them. They're like, yep. This is exactly what we're seeing. This is part of that mental health crisis that we've also been talking about. But you might be asking if this is your work to do. So it's a decline of institutional trust and an increase in isolation and loneliness. Is this actually my work to do as a religious leader? Those are really tragic things. And of course, we wish they were different. But is it something I can fix? Well, I think there are very real spiritual implications for that loneliness and isolation. We've been learning a lot about that over the last couple of years at Springtide. When you feel overwhelmed and don't know what to do about something, who do you turn to for help? I'm thinking about overwhelmed. That's the focus of this year's State of Religion and Young People. You can see it right behind me. Kevin will drop the link into the chat if he hasn't already. So when we think about like a pandemic as a thing that might overwhelm you, who do you turn to? Well, young people are as likely to say nobody, 16%, as they are to feel like they can turn to or should turn to someone from their faith community. They simply don't see religious leaders as a resource that is accessible to them, even if what we know is the case is that those religious leaders desperately want to connect with them, that they have their best interests in mind, that they're really trying to do things that matter for young people. Young people simply don't see that as the reality in their lives. And we're not always doing a great job as religious leaders to help bridge that divide. We did a survey in the first days of the pandemic, late March of 2020, early April, just a quick little flash survey. And one of the questions we asked was, who's reached out to you, if anyone? Again, check all that apply. In those early days of the pandemic, it was 1% of young people who had been reached out to by a faith leader. And so we thought, we'll do this again 1 year later. And so we did it in March of this year, late February, early March of 2021. And we thought, surely this number will have changed. And it has changed. It went all the way up to 10%. A whole year of the most disruptive, tumultuous thing that anybody can possibly think of, that nobody has a framework for making sense out of. And only 10% of young people say that they've been reached out to by a faith leader. The wrong way to think about this is to think that this is the failure of individuals. It's not. It simply is not. Have not yet a single youth director. I've given 75 talks in the last 18 months about Springtide's data. We've been all over the country. I've not met a single youth director or religious leader who isn't working hard enough, who isn't well-intentioned enough, who doesn't care enough. They all do. This is a failure of our systems to understand what's going on in 2021, and instead largely relying on structures that were really effective in, say, 1991. And we're trying to use those old structures to meet modern needs without realizing exactly how this world has shifted. In other words, we're using high institutional trust assumption systems in a low institutional trust environment. We're still largely trying to get young people to come to us. And on the one hand, we've got young people saying, I'm really interested in this conversation. I would love to connect with somebody. I'll do basically anything except walk through the threshold of your door, real or metaphorical. And we've got a bunch of religious, well-intentioned religious leaders saying, I'll do anything for you. I would love to connect with you. I want to support you in whatever way that I can. You just have to come through this door. And we don't think, my position, this is editorializing, is that that's not the incumbent upon the young person to bridge that divide. We need to get better systems in place about making those connections. In the absence of that, what young people are doing is this thing that we call faith unbundling to help them make sense of this world that isn't very easy to make sense out of. And where faith used to be maybe my parents' generation, a sort of take it or leave it option, like a waiter bringing you a meal. You could choose to eat or not eat. That was your only choice. Then at some point, it evolves. We get the internet. When I was a kid, I was exposed to a lot more people of different backgrounds. The world was a little bit more diverse, and it became more like a menu. I was at least aware of the fact that Christianity existed along with Buddhism and Judaism and other world religions. And I could pick one of those systems, but that's not how Gen Z thinks about this at all. For Gen Z, this is more like going to a dinner party. People are bringing aspects of their own traditions. They're in conversation with each other. They're building plates that are filled with all kinds of different rituals and practices and beliefs and prayers and rites. And they're doing so with the help of each other to guide them through that. They really are, they don't just, in the absence of connection with you all, they don't just say, well, I guess I don't care about connection. They're turning to each other to help them navigate these situations, help them navigate what it means to believe. And they're doing so in a world where this generation is the most diverse generation that has ever existed in any society in the history of the world. And so they're encountering more new things than ever before. Diversity is the key to understanding not only the values of Gen Z, but the experiences of Gen Z. This trust revolution that has led to a belonging crisis with very real spiritual implications then can only be solved through relationship. I want you to take a look at this graph here. On the light green is the total sample, everybody we talk to, and the dark green is those who attend religious gatherings. We asked them the series of loneliness scale questions, and then we broke it out. And what you see is there's no difference between those who attend religious gatherings and those who don't on having nobody to talk to, feeling completely alone, feeling as if no one understands me. No difference. It doesn't matter if you attend in terms of counteracting your loneliness or increasing your sense of belonging. Now, what does matter is if you attend and have a connection to a trusted adult at that thing that you're attending. It's the relationship that matters more than anything else, more than it ever has. And that magic number for relationships is 5. So if we can get a young person to be connected to 5 trusted adults, so we see, I've just picked 4 variables out here, you can see them. We see a decline in all of these risk factors and an increase in all kinds of pro-social behaviors, as well as an increase in all kinds of belief behaviors and expressions that we would care about. You don't have to be all 5 of those. Ideally, they have a parent in place or 2, a guardian. They have teachers and coaches. But getting religious communities connected to young people to be part of this solution for 5 is vital, because trust levels for institutions are low, but trust levels for relationships are incredibly high. So when we see adults doing relationships, embodying these 5 dimensions that we talk about in our relational authority model, we see trust levels up over 90% for each of them individually and for the entirety of them. These things are listening, transparency, integrity, care, and expertise. All right, there's plenty more to share from 2 years worth of data collection and 23,000 data points, but I will stop there because I know that we've got a little bit more time and conversation, but also I want to make sure and stick to the time frame that we have.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh. Thanks also for your flexibility. I know that we're running a little bit behind. Chad, what I'd like to do is send people into groups for 5 minutes. I've used the same document. You don't need a fresh link. I've put 3 options for us to interact around Josh's material. Thank you so much, Josh. Riveting. I appreciate it so much. Go ahead and push us out, and then we'll come back, and then Dan Allen will just give us some highlights for what's coming next for EveryCampus.